Well, February ended fairly quickly, which it usually does, but that means it is now March, a month where we will herald the official beginning of spring. But for those of you who are baseball fans, spring has already begun with spring training down in Florida as the baseball teams gather and work out their kinks from the winter so they can be ready to play when the summer really begins. And it reminds me of my youth when I was playing baseball, probably in about fourth grade at Balboa Park in Los Angeles, California. The fields had been watered because it doesn't really rain in California, and there was actually this pile of mud sort of in the batter's box near home plate. And this was fourth grade. We were just learning the basic skills. So practice consisted of some very basic kind of things, like running around the bases in the right order, which, as those of us who've watched Little League know, is sometimes a challenge. So each of my teammates took their turn running around the bases, and the coach said, "Watch out for the mud, watch out for the mud," and people sort of stepped aside as they came by home plate. And then it was my turn to make my way around the bases. I took off at lightning fast speed, rounded first, headed to second, rounded second, headed to third, rounded third, headed home, and slid right into the mud. And there was sort of a gasp. I believe my mother was there watching at this time. And it makes me realize I had a good time. But we look at mud very differently as adults than we do as children. As children, it is this joyful sort of place to play and revel in. It is a gift from God. And I bring the idea of mud up and our perception of it in this story that we have today, where mud is used by Jesus to heal this man who was blind from birth. Now, the interesting thing about this mud is what it does and how we look at it. And this wonderful story that we have today has all these elements and nuances. There's really 6 different little stories in it. And each of them gives us a chance to ask a question about how we perceive the world, how we perceive what God has given us. Do we look at the pile of mud and say that this is dirt and something that should be avoided, or do we look at it as something we should jump into with glee and joy? And so let's look at this story that we have from the gospel and the questions that it brings up each step of the way. First, we have this man who was blind from birth, who had not asked for Jesus to heal him. The disciples just saw him. They got into an argument about who had sinned, but that wasn't really important. What Jesus did in this is said, it doesn't matter who sinned. What is there is something that is to be used for God's glory. The reason this man is blind is so that we can tell this story. This dirt, this mud, this thing that is wrong is really a gift. And so Jesus uses that to heal this man. And so it gives us a chance to ask the question in our lives: where do we look at our brokenness and complain versus where do we look at our brokenness and recognize it as a place for God's grace to enter in? When do we find ourselves in the mud, ready to embrace that mud versus cursing the mud? So after this man is healed, he then goes back to his old neighborhood that he can now see for the first time. And rather than being embraced in joy and happiness in this, the friends and neighbors are all sort of like, maybe it's him, maybe it's not him. And this is where the mudslinging comes in. They're almost calling him names. They don't believe it. They are not ready to embrace this gift from God. They're not ready to see what had happened. They're not ready to see why it happened. And so they start slinging the mud. And if they can't sling enough of it, they send him to the Pharisees. The Pharisees, the people in authority, those in control. And what do they say about this gift from God? Well, he did it on the wrong day of the week. Are we the ones who sometimes want to impose when God's grace can be shared? Why won't we let others play in the mud when all we want to do is sling the mud instead and say that they're playing in it at the wrong time? When somebody is doing something that may not seem right, how can we look at a way to revel in it rather than reject it? So the story goes on. We go and talk to this man's parents. And you would think that they would at least be excited about what had gone on. But they too were like, hey, we don't want to get in trouble, so, he's old enough. Let him answer the question for himself. Parents were afraid of the mud. They were afraid of what was in it, afraid of what it meant, afraid of what would happen to them. And how often are we like that? How often do we deny God's grace because of our own fears, founded or unfounded? What are we scared of? Getting a little bit dirty? Maybe that's a good thing. And so, after the parents, the man gets more interrogation. The Pharisees again ask him, what happened? Why did it happen? How did you get cured? He said, I've told you. And so the Pharisees sling some more mud. They sling mud and sling him out. He's excommunicated. He gets kicked out because he experienced God's grace, and they weren't ready to believe it. So Jesus then returns to the scene and says, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. It begs this interesting question throughout this whole story. When we see, we are sometimes limited by that perception. And God wants us to become blind so that we can have our eyes opened in new ways. And sometimes we are just blind and need God to open our eyes so that we can see in the first place. It's a challenging little twist of a passage, but I bring it back to this mud. I bring it back to how we look at the things in our world and the choice that we make to embrace them as part of God's gift or reject them as something else entirely. We need to open our eyes to the grace of God and stop seeing the world as entirely clean. We need to embrace the brokenness as part of God's grace. We need to revel in God's grace. We need to open our eyes so we can see the fear and let go of it. So in this season of Lent, we probably need to stop slinging the mud and start playing in it.